Hi everyone. This lecture will give you a very brief introduction to blockchain technology. At its core, blockchain technology allows the digital transfer of value, similar to the internet, which allows the digital transfer of information. So in order to understand this, let's take an example of a normal transfer. So what I have in mind here is there's two people, Sue and Bob, and what they want to do is they want to make a transfer. Right? So what do we do here? Well, a simple example would be that Bob wants to sell Sue his car. So now, what does this car look like? Obviously he transfers the car itself, but part of a value transfer for a car is also the transfer of the title, which is a registration that happens with the government. Now, in return, what Sue is doing is she has to give Bob money. Now, for the time being, let's focus only on the money transfer. How is that normally done? Well, generally speaking, it's not directly. You can do it obviously with cash, but more commonly, especially for something as large as a car, what you do is you need a digital transfer or an electronic transfer. So you use Visa, MasterCard, or a wire transfer of some form for Bob to receive his money from Sue. Now, this sounds really awfully simple, but the logistics of the transfers are actually rather complicated. And I'm going to run you through a few examples of the way how transfers of money work so that you understand them. So now the simplest case, of course, is that you transfer simply cash. That is straightforward. Everybody knows how it goes. And that is not something that we're interested in because we're interested in digital transfers, of course. Now, if you do a digital transfer, the way you do this is you use essentially a bank. If Bob and Sue bank with the same bank, it's completely straightforward because all that happens is that when Sue wants to transfer money to Bob, they tell the bank to do it, and what the bank does, it effectively just changes a ledger entry, which is the account of Sue, debits that account, say takes money out of that account and puts it into Bob's account. That's completely straightforward, and again, is not a problem. We're not interested in that one. I mean, we could be interested, but this is not what we're trying to get after. Now let's think of a situation where they have different banks, which is much more common. So in Canada, for instance, we have about 30 different banks. If they would be in the US, there's several thousand different banks. Okay, and so now when you have several thousand different banks, it becomes a lot more complicated. So as an example, the simplest example is actually one where the two banks have a relationship. So effectively what they do is they have accounts with one another. And so then when Sue makes the transfer to Bob, the way it's done is that Sue instructs her own bank. The bank basically takes the money out of Sue's account, puts it into Bob's bank account at Sue's bank, then sends a message to Bob's bank, and Bob's bank does it the other way around. So they take money out of Sue's bank's bank account at its own bank and puts it into Bob's bank account. And then everybody's happy again. The transfer has happened. So that again is relatively straightforward. If you have a small number of banks that can have these interbank relationships. In reality, however, if you think of a country like the US where there are several thousand different banks, it's unlikely that they all have accounts with one another. And in fact, actually, in the old days, that provided quite a problem. So if somebody sent a check, which is essentially the same way as sending money, as it's not digital, it comes with a piece of paper, but the principle is the same. Sending a check from, say, just New Jersey to New York could be something that involves dozens of parties and could take days to clear. Right? So because the way it had to work in the old days was that one bank had to find a chain of other banks that had banking relationships such that the check could clear. And that's very complicated. It's actually very labor intensive and very costly. So now what is the solution to that? Well, the solution to that is to enable and to create a central bank. And the central bank effectively would enable these transfers. How does it do that? Well, it does that by requiring all of the banks to have an account with the central bank. And then again, the situation is quite straightforward because all that Sue has to do is she has to instruct her bank to make that transfer. The bank then informs the central bank that it wants to make the transfer. What the central bank does, it takes money out of Sue's bank account, puts it into Bob's bank account, informs Bob's bank of the account of the transfer having happened, and then everything is hunky-dory again. All right, so this is why we have a central bank effectively, so that you can have these transfers of value. And as a little side note, these transfers don't happen instantaneously. There's usually a clearing period. And the way how banks store money and how much money they store with the central bank and so on and so forth is one of the mechanisms by which monetary policy is transmitted into an economy. Now that's something for a bigger discussion at a later point when we talk about payments. I just want to allude to the fact that it exists. But you see already here one other problem, right? So what happens if Sue is in Canada and Bob is in the US? How would it work then? Well, then there is no central bank that can facilitate the transfer, right? Because the Canadian Central Bank, the Bank of Canada, does not have a direct relationship. Well, it does, but it has a different relationship. It's not the same. There's not a single central bank, right? So there's the Bank of Canada, and then there is the Federal Reserve System in the US. So how can you create an international transfer? Well, this is where it gets extremely complex. In international transfers, usually you go through something that's called the SWIFT network. And the SWIFT network is effectively what I alluded to earlier in the example of where a check was sent from New Jersey to New York. It's a system of correspondent banks. And the SWIFT network, really what it is a system of electronic messages. And so if you want to send money from one country to another country, it's a pretty big process, right? Because it goes through the network, goes to several different correspondent banks, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and costs a lot to do. But this is basically how the modern banking world today works, more or less. And just so you know, it sounds cumbersome. And in fact, it doesn't even work for the banks themselves, right? So if you take HSBC, it's a worldwide bank. It's one of the biggest banks in the world. But even for them, transferring money from HSBC UK to HSBC Canada is complicated. So now what we are talking about when we think about blockchain technology is one step back. So what we see here is this is a complex system. It involves many parties. It is expensive in the sense of not that people have to pay high fees, but also it really creates a lot of costs. And there are a lot of frictions in there and possible points of failure. All of this is undesirable. And so now what blockchain technology is, and what blockchain technology takes as a view is to say, well, why is it like that? Could we not do this differently? So the crazy thought is, wouldn't it be possible and wouldn't it be nice if there would be a single ledger, so a single piece of information, a point of information where this transfer could occur? And that essentially is the core of blockchain technology, where we want to have a single ledger that has the information so that these transfers can easily happen. Now, I don't want to lie that there are actually existing solutions, at least within specific countries, but also going around that. So here's a few examples. There is WeChat. So for those of you who have a WeChat account in a non-Chinese, you will not have access to WeChat Pay, but for those of you who have a Chinese account, you will probably use WeChat every single day, especially when you're in China. But you can also use it in Canada. We come to that later. There's Apple Pay. So Apple has its own internal system, not operated in Canada, but in the US. It's called Apple Card. And there's PayPal. PayPal is also the idea that you have a single ledger. Now, there are concerns with any of these solutions. First of all, there's a question of power concentration, of monopolies, of hackability, of security. There's any number of issues around with that. But I would allude to the fact that there are actually financial institutions, actually not just financial institutions, but tech companies in particular, that try to find solutions to resolve the complication.